Hi, everyone, and welcome to Biosimilars for IBD, Making the Transition. If you have inflammatory bowel disease, you know there are multiple therapies that can help you enjoy a healthy, fulfilling life. Advanced therapies like biologics have dramatically improved the lives of patients with IBD in Canada and around the world for the past 15 to 20 years. More recently, a new class of biologic drug medicines have arrived in Canada called biosimilars. There is a lot of talk about biosimilars today, what they are, who should take them, and most recently, doctors transitioning their patients from a reference biologic drug, or the original, to its biosimilar. Today's webinar is going to answer the following questions. The difference between a reference biologic drug and the biosimilar. Biosimilars, what Health Canada is saying. What's the clinical evidence that is available to date? Are there any concerns with biosimilars? And then we'll hear from a patient who has successfully made the transition from a biologic to a biosimilar. Tonight's presentation has been made possible through an unrestricted educational grant from Pfizer Canada. Some patients are transitioning and others are not. If you have IBD, how do you decide if it's right for you? With the help of your healthcare professional team, this is ultimately your decision. Knowledge is power, and today's presentation will include Dr. Jeffrey McCurdy, Assistant Professor at the University of Ottawa and a member of the IBD Center of Excellence at the University of Ottawa. As I stated before, we'll also be hearing real-world experience from Kathy, a patient who has successfully transitioned from a biologic to a biosimilar. There will be, at the end of the presentations, a 10-minute question and answer period. And at that point, we will answer questions that you can have the opportunity to enter as we go through the presentation. So please enter your questions at the right-hand panel at any time throughout the webinar. I'll now turn it over to Dr. McCurdy.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'd like to thank the CDHF for the opportunity, and thanks for all of the listeners out there. When I was first asked to give this presentation, my initial instinct was biosimilars. Well, that's not a very interesting topic in inflammatory bowel disease, but given the current economic climate in Canada, I think it's a very important topic. So I hope that you enjoy this presentation and you learn from this talk. So what I thought I'd begin with is to discuss some of the major treatment advances in inflammatory bowel disease over the past 20 years. And by far and away, the most significant advancement that we've seen is the introduction of biologic therapy for inflammatory bowel disease. Now, the first biologic to hit the market was Remicade, and this was in the early 2000s. And this followed a landmark clinical trial that was conducted and published in the late 1990s. Now, since then, we've had a number of additional biologics that have hit the market, and ones that may be familiar to you, such as Humira, vedolizumab, also known as Entyvio, as well as Stelara. And so there's no doubt that these medications have improved the lives for patients with inflammatory bowel disease. Now, not only have there been advances in the types of medications that are available in inflammatory bowel disease, but we've also learned over the years how best to use these medications. And so our treatment approaches have changed considerably. We now understand that if we use these treatments earlier in the course of therapy, that it can improve outcomes for our patients. We also have learned that it's no longer acceptable to treat simply to improve symptoms for our patients. And we now realize that if we actually heal the bowel, and so this is known as a treat-to-target approach, that it can improve outcomes for patients as well. And then finally, we've also realized that after surgery, it's important to follow patients closely and use medications to prevent the disease from reoccurring. So as I'm sure you can all appreciate, with all of these new medications and the changes in our treatment approach where we're becoming more aggressive with treatments, that it's going to cost the healthcare system considerably. So moving on to the next slide, if you can't appreciate the increases in the healthcare costs from those points, well, here's an example of some of the newer medications that are being investigated in clinical trials. And over time, some of these medications will be available for our healthcare system. And so I think with these new medications and the differences in how we treat patients, I'm sure you can now appreciate that treatment costs will continue to rise. And an important question, can we really afford this? So this brings us to biosimilars. Biosimilars offer the potential for healthcare savings. And so one of the questions that I often have from my patients is, well, what is a biologic and what's a biosimilar, and how are they different? So when you think of a reference biologic, this is the original medication that came to market, so one of the original biologics. And so examples include Remicade, Humira, Entyvio, and Stelara. So each of these molecules, these are large proteins. They're not the traditional chemical medications that we're used to, such as our blood pressure medications, or even traditional medications for inflammatory bowel disease, such as methotrexate, Imuran, as well as the mesalamine products, such as Mesavant, Pentasa, and so on. Now, the biologic medications, they're very large, they're complex proteins, and they're made from living organisms, hence the term biologic. And so these molecules are designed to target various inflammatory pathways to help treat autoimmune diseases. But biologics can also be used for other indications, such as cancer and even diabetes. Now, what about a biosimilar? Biosimilars are highly similar to the reference biologic medication. However, because the biologics are so complex, it's impossible to make an exact copy of the reference biologic, and hence the term biosimilar. And just to illustrate this point better, I've included two figures on the right-hand side of your slide, and the top figure is mesalamine. So anyone with ulcerative colitis is likely used to the medication Pentasa or Asacol, Salofolk, Mesavant. And so these have pretty simple chemical structures, and as a result, they can be copied, and that's the basis of our generic medication. Now, in contrast to this, if you look at the bottom panel, this is the three-dimensional structure of infliximab, also known as Remicade or Inflectra. And you can see that it's a very complex molecule that's folded in different ways to form this 3D structure. And the 3D structure is essential for the functioning of the product. And so this can kind of, again, give you an idea of how complex these molecules are and how it's very difficult to make an exact replica. So because of that, manufacturers must demonstrate that the biosimilar, there are no clinically meaningful differences in quality, safety, or effectiveness of the biosimilar compared to the reference medication. Now, the requirements to approve biologics and biosimilars are quite rigorous, and there are potential differences between biologics and biosimilars. So for biologics, they initially undergo a number of preclinical tests, and these tests are done in cell culture systems to make sure that the medication is pure, to characterize the structure of the medication, to make sure that it neutralizes the appropriate target. And once this is done, the medications are then tested in clinical trials. And it goes through pretty rigorous clinical trial testing to make sure that the medication is both safe and effective. Now, the same requirements for biosimilars are slightly different. Much of the work to investigate a biosimilar is done in the preclinical phase to make sure that it's as close as possible in structure and function and purity as the biologic. When it comes to clinical trials, the biosimilars also require clinical trials, but not necessarily as rigorous as the original biologic. And I'll talk about this a little bit more shortly. So if we move on, what are the studies to date that have shown the effectiveness and safety of biosimilars? And so with respect to inflammatory bowel disease, there have been 2 pivotal trials. The first clinical trial is called the Norse Switch Study. And this was a study that was performed in Norway, as the name of the trial would suggest. And it was a study that was funded by the Norwegian government. And this was a study whereby they looked at patients who were already treated with infliximab, also known as Remicade. And this included patients that had a variety of autoimmune diseases such as ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, psoriasis, as well as rheumatoid arthritis. And so this was a randomized controlled trial designed to ask the question, can we safely switch to a biosimilar, and will it be just as effective as continuing with the biologic medication? And so to do this trial, they took patients that were already on Remicade, who were doing well, and they then randomized these patients to either continue Remicade or switch to a biosimilar, and in this case it was Inflectra. At the time of the trial, Inflectra was known as CTP-13. In this trial, roughly 50% of the patients had inflammatory bowel disease, whereas the other patients had different autoimmune conditions. And they followed the patients for 52 weeks, and they looked to see if the patients were still in remission or if the patients had a flare. And what they concluded from the study was that the biosimilar was not clinically different from the originator molecule, being Remicade. So there was no differences in safety or effectiveness, and importantly, there is no differences in immunogenicity. Now, you've probably heard your gastroenterologist talk about immunogenicity, and this is the body's ability to develop an immune response against a biologic medication. When this occurs, it's not good, and it typically means that the medication will no longer be effective. Now, one of the interesting points from the study is that when you look at each individual autoimmune disease, you could see that there were slight differences in the response to switching to the biosimilar. And when you look at Crohn's disease, there looked like there was a trend that the biosimilar may not be as effective in Crohn's disease as some of the other autoimmune diseases. And as a result, we had this lingering question. And so that leads us to the next clinical trial. And so this was an extremely important trial because it was conducted only in patients with Crohn's disease. And this was to test 2 questions. One, to determine if a biosimilar was equally effective as the originator molecule, and then also to test if you can safely switch from one to the other. And so in this trial, this was a very large clinical trial, and they looked at patients with Crohn's disease who had never been treated with a biologic medication. These patients were then randomized to either receive Remicade or Inflectra. The patients were followed for a total of 30 weeks, and then after that, the patients may have undergone switching. So, as an example, in the top figure where you see the Remicade, half of those patients would have been switched to Inflectra after 30 weeks, and the other half of the patients would have continued on with Remicade. And the same happened for the baby blue figure, or the baby blue bar, with Inflectra. So after 30 weeks, half of those patients would have continued on Inflectra and the other half would switch to Remicade. In this trial, they found that there were no significant differences between the biosimilar and the reference biologic in terms of effectiveness and safety and immunogenicity. So even after you switched from one biologic to the other, it didn't seem that your immune system was more likely to develop an immune response. So what does Health Canada say? Well, I think Health Canada would agree that for a biosimilar, there can't be any clinically meaningful difference between the biosimilar and the reference biologic. However, the question becomes, what is Health Canada's definition of clinically meaningful difference? And the reason I bring this up is because for the approval of some of these medications, it appears as though Health Canada has decided that it will allow extrapolation from other disease processes. So what do I mean by this? Well, if you were doing a clinical trial in rheumatoid arthritis where you're testing if Remicade is similar to Inflectra, so the reference biologic and the biosimilar, and if you show in rheumatoid arthritis that they're equally effective, well, Health Canada feels that that is sufficient to allow it to be used in a different disease process such as Remicade. And I'm not so sure that that should be the way that these medications are approved. Currently, Health Canada has approved at least 10 biosimilars, 3 of which are approved for inflammatory bowel disease. In my practice, currently I have experience with Inflectra as the only biosimilar. So why are transitions being made? Well, I think it's very obvious is that there's a considerable strain on our healthcare system, and it's likely not sustainable. So we need to come up with inventive strategies to save on cost but still provide excellent care for our patients. And so biosimilars may be a way that we can achieve this. And so the idea is that if biosimilars can reduce the cost for healthcare, then maybe we have more medication available for different indications and to support our patients. And there's also a thought that maybe by the use of biosimilars, it frees up drug plan budget to be able to reinvest into our healthcare, whether it's development of innovative therapies or approaches to treatment. However, we do know that most of the drug development programs are sponsored by pharma companies, so I think we have to be careful with this. Now, we've talked about the benefits of biosimilars, but are there any concerns? And I've listed here a number of potential concerns that I think we should all be aware of. So a question that I have is, there are many different biosimilars that will be coming to market. And my question is, will all biosimilars require the same rigorous scientific testing as Inflectra, as we've seen from the clinical trials? Another concern is, will there be an increased rate of immunogenicity with multiple switches? So you can probably imagine that if your healthcare coverage changes and different health plans cover unique biologics or biosimilars, you may have to switch from one to another and back to another. And with multiple switches, that might increase your risk of developing antibodies. And so we at this point, we don't know the answer to that question. So I would say caution is required. So the next important point is, will these biosimilar companies all have the same patient support programs? And we know from these well-established companies that they have very excellent patient support systems. And so my hope would be that the biosimilar companies have similar support systems. Sometimes patients aren't covered for biologics, and the companies provide compassionate drug coverage. And so that's been very important for some of my patients, and I'd hope that that would continue if we're moving towards biosimilars. And finally, the next 2 points relate to how are we going to invest for scientific advancement, and will this continue with biosimilars? And finally, is the government truly going to reinvest potential savings for the healthcare back into our healthcare system so we can continue to improve care for our patients? So I would say that these are potential concerns that we need to think about. And I would ask that each and every one of you empower yourself to learn as much as you can about the biosimilars. So please ask your gastroenterologist. If your gastroenterologist recommends switching to a biosimilar, ask your gastroenterologist has this biosimilar been studied in a rigorous way in patients with inflammatory bowel disease? Do I have any concerns? And is my disease stable that this is a good time to make a switch? And are there any implications that I should be aware of in the transitioning process? So I will leave you with that, and now we'll hear from a patient story.
Thanks, Dr. McCurdy. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Kathy, who has successfully transitioned to a biosimilar, and she's going to share her experience with us. Thanks for joining us, Kathy. If
Hi.
you could begin with a brief history about yourself and then share events leading up to and after your transition, that would be great. Dr. McCurdy and or I may jump in with questions as you go along, okay?
Okay. So I was diagnosed with Crohn's in 2015. I had gone to the hospital, had emergency surgery because I had a blockage. That's how I was diagnosed with Crohn's. And then I had to get a bowel resection done, so I lost part of my small bowel. And so I ended up seeing a specialist originally in Peterborough, and unfortunately he's not available anymore. So I had to transfer to Lindsay. And initially I was put on medication called mercaptopurine. It's a pill. And it wasn't really doing 100% for me. So when I was admitted to the hospital a second time, my specialist came in to see me and had mentioned initially Remicade to me, and I asked him what it was and how I had to go about it and stuff. And it is an infusion. It's administered through IV, and so I had to go through finding out whether I was covered through our drug plan. Unfortunately, I wasn't, so then I had to apply through Trillium, and Trillium approved me. And I spoke to the support team for Remicade at that time, and they helped me with the co-payment plan that I had to pay, and that's how I got started on Remicade. And because initially I am from Lindsay, Ontario, and I was going to the clinic in Lindsay, but I have no veins pretty much, so they had a hard time starting IVs on me, so I had to transfer to Peterborough, and I was getting it down there. And unfortunately, I don't drive, so I had to get community care to take me. And so then my specialist was opening up an office in his office. So I figured it'd be easier for me to get there than it was to Peterborough. So I had talked to him about switching from Remicade to the Inflectro program, and we had talked about it, and I said that it would probably be easier for me to get there than to Peterborough, and so then he had tried to set it up through the support program that offered that, and he had to go through. Actually, my husband's work actually covers 80% of my Inflectra, and then Trillium covers the other 20%. And it took a little bit to get it all figured out, but we got it figured out, and I started, I believe, in October, and it seems to be working good for me.
Okay, Kathy, I'm just interested to find out, how did you get introduced to the Inflectra program? Was it
Dr. Chan had mentioned it to me when I was in to one of my appointments, and he explained a little bit about it, and he had told me that it was similar to kind of Remicade, but it was like a it's hard to explain. Like a lower. It's not like it was cheap. It was cheaper, basically, is what he told me,
right.
Cost-wise. But it would do the same thing for me as the Remicade did.
But it was more of your situation in the sense of not having access to a vehicle and your location.
Yeah, it was more to make it easier and convenient for me. And also, I find that Inflectra is actually helping me out a little bit more than the Remicade, as my situation was, instead of being having to run to the bathroom, I was backing up. And for now, I'm actually like loosening up and being able to go instead of being backed up with the Inflectra. So it seems to be helping.
What is there anything that you've experienced in your whole journey through here that you would want other patients to know about? We find that we hear from so many patients with IBD. One of the questions is, I wish I knew that back then, you know.
Yeah, with my situation, like before they actually administer the Inflectra, I get a steroid first. I have to have gravel, otherwise it upsets my stomach. And then I get the Inflectra. So if you like experience nausea or anything like that, then I would suggest getting gravel to keep your stomach settled.
Okay. I just wondering, Dr. McCurdy, do you have any questions that you would like to ask?
Well, I think that Kathy, you raise a very important point that sometimes that I take for granted. So working in Ottawa, we have the luxury of having numerous infusion centers for our biologics and our biosimilars, but it's true that access to treatments can be difficult for our patients, especially those that don't live in an urban center. And so it's often one of the things that I sort of look past, and I leave it to my coordinators to help to sort out. And so I think that's an important thing. When you went through the application for Remicade and Inflectra, did you notice any differences?
Not really, no. I find the Inflectra a lot better than the Remicade. I find that the Inflectra was helping me a lot more than the Remicade did. Because with the Remicade, I was having problems even being able to go, compared to the Inflectra. The Inflectra has helped me. I'm not so cramped. I don't get the cramps as bad as I used to, and I'm able to go. Like now I'm starting to go every day, for a while there I'd be lucky if I went once every 3 days,
Mm-hmm. I think it's probably important to point out for the audience that in terms of Inflectra being more effective than Remicade, so that certainly when we look at the clinical trials, we see that they're equally effective. They're both very effective for the treatment of inflammatory bowel disease, and we don't see any significant difference between the two medications. Now, it's very interesting that even when patients are treated with the same medication, that over time their condition may improve. And so sometimes it's just a matter of time before things improve. But we've also learned from treating patients that we often have to optimize medications to make sure that they are working as best as they can. And so that may mean that we check the levels of medications in our patient's bloodstream. Yeah. And when the levels are really low, we need to optimize the dosing, and that may mean that we provide higher doses or more frequent doses. And then sometimes we need to add on additional medications to make these biologics more effective.
Yeah, I get my blood tested every infusion, and then just recently I had my levels checked, and my levels were good. But he's gone from my specialist has gone from having me go every 8 weeks to every 6 weeks, because it's really only I'm good for about the 4 weeks, and then by the last 2 weeks I start running into problems.
Right, and I should also point out is that we've only begun to learn about the levels of these medications for the treatment of inflammatory bowel disease. We've only really begun to understand them in the past 3, 4, 5 years. And so it's still an evolving field. And we are learning that there are different types of Crohn's disease that may require different levels of medication to effectively treat those. And so I'll give you an example. There are some patients that have Crohn's disease that only involves their bowel, where there are other patients with Crohn's disease that have perianal fistulas. And we've learned that likely the patients with perianal fistulas require higher levels of their Remicade or Inflectra or their other biologics, if they're on a different type of biologic, to be effective. And so that just points out that different types of Crohn's disease can be more difficult or more of a challenge to treat than others.
This is true.
Okay, well, Kathy, this has been a great session. Thank you for sharing your experience. I'd like to now move to our Q&A because we do have a lot of questions coming in, as you can imagine. So I'll ask both you and Dr. McCurdy to hang on while we sort through the questions, and I will make sure that I direct the ones to your appropriate person. So, Dr. McCurdy, one of the questions that we have is, did all patients in the studies who are in remission while on Remicade remain in remission after the switch to the biosimilar?
So that's an excellent question, and the answer is no. And so about 30% of patients flared after the switch to Inflectra or those that continued on Remicade. And so the numbers of patients that flared were the same in both groups. And so that highlights the importance of doing these randomized control trials. So if you were only to take patients, if you're only to conduct a single-arm study, and so that means if you were to take the patients who were on Remicade and you were to switch them to Inflectra, and 30% of patients began to have symptoms, you would think, uh-oh, there's a problem with this medication. But because there was an appropriate control where you compared the patients to continue Remicade versus those to switch to Inflectra, you had the appropriate control so you could see the effect of the medication. And I should point out that in these trials, these were blinded studies. And so that meant that the patients who were receiving the treatment and the physicians involved in the treatment, both sets of people were blinded. So they were not aware if the patients were getting the biosimilar or the reference biologic. And we know from our clinical trials that blinding patients and blinding physicians are very important to prevent bias from entering into the studies.
Okay, another question. How are biosimilars given? Either through an IV infusion or self-injection or oral? And I know that this is probably different from one therapeutic area to the other, but Dr. McCurdy, can you address that?
Absolutely. So you can consider, as much as I've been saying that the biosimilar is as similar as we can possibly get to the reference molecule, and that it's not identical, everything about this medication in terms of how it's given is going to be the exact same as the reference molecule. So for biologics, we have biologics that are given both intravenously and orally. And so the biosimilar would be the same. It would, if the reference molecule was given intravenously, the biosimilar would be also given intravenously with the exact same timing. And if the reference medication is given subcutaneously by injection, then the biosimilar would also be given subcutaneously by injection. Because these molecules are so large, they can't be given orally, and therefore they must be given intravenously or by injection. Now we do have new classes of molecules that are becoming available. They are not biologics. They're called small molecule medications, and they can be given orally.
Okay, a question for you, Kathy. How long were you on Remicade prior to the switch?
About a year.
Okay. Dr. McCurdy, if you try a biosimilar or if you are transitioned to a biosimilar and it doesn't work, can you switch back to the original?
It really depends on the reason why it's not working. So for some patients, the reason a medication won't work is because you don't have sufficient levels of the medication in your system. In that situation, you wouldn't need to switch back to the biologic medication. You would simply need to adjust your dose, and hopefully that would allow you to recapture a response. The other possibility is that you've developed antibodies. So once people start to develop antibodies, especially if the antibodies if they're at a sufficiently high level, it's unlikely that the medication will ever work again. And this holds true for the biosimilar and the biologic. So to give you an example, if I had a patient that was treated with Remicade and they developed high levels of antibodies to Remicade, and that was the reason why Remicade stopped working, it would be inappropriate for me to change my patient to the biosimilar. Because even when you use the biosimilar, the antibodies that your body has developed will also react with the biosimilar, and it can potentially cause an infusion reaction, and again, the biosimilar will not be effective. The third option is sometimes these medications simply don't work, even if they're at a high level in our system, even if our body doesn't develop antibodies to the medication, and in those situations, we know that the drug of choice, that the target of that immune pathway is just not the right one for that patient. And so in those situations, we would want to use a completely different class of medications. So that would also be an example of where if you were treated with a biosimilar, you wouldn't want to go back to the original biologic medication. You would want to go to a completely separate medication class.
Okay. Is another question is if when transitioning from a biologic to a biosimilar, does the patient have to have a period of time before they actually start the biosimilar, or can they just continue with the course of treatment?
These are absolutely excellent questions, all of them. And the answer to that is no, you would just continue exactly as you have been receiving your medication. So for instance, if you were treated with Inflectra every 8 weeks and you were switching to Remicade, you would continue with the 8-week pattern or 8-week interval.
Okay. Another question. Have any long-term studies been done on biosimilars? What long-term side effects should a patient be aware of if switched to a biosimilar?
Again, an excellent question. So we do have real-world experience from different countries. And so in a variety of European countries, switching to a biosimilar became mandatory several years ago. And so from these studies, we do have long-term follow-up with the biologics, but we certainly do not have the same data that we do have with our original biologics. And so the two prototypical medications are Remicade and Humira. And from Remicade and Humira, we have our longest registry trials demonstrating their safety. So with the biosimilars, we have very good studies in the short term to show that they're equally as safe as the reference biologics, but we don't have the same long-term data.
Okay. Well, we've come to the end of our audience participation in the way of questions. I would like to thank Kathy for taking time out of your daily routine and coming on board with us tonight. It was a pleasure to talk with you. And also like to thank Dr. McCurdy for pulling together a very insightful presentation for everyone. Is there any closing remarks, Dr. McCurdy, that you'd like to make?
I'd like to thank you for having me, and I hope this was interesting to the audience. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Remember that the webinar will be posted on our website within the next couple of days. So, if you know anyone who had planned to come online with us tonight and couldn't make it, then you'll be able to direct them to cdhf.ca to take a listen. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.